It's been almost an entire year since the last expansion for Hearts of Iron 4 released, namely No Step Back, which, geez, how's it been 10 months already? Back then the focus was on the Soviet Union, but now, By Blood Alone focuses first and foremost on the long-forgotten nation of Italy, which hasn't really been touched at all since release. But of course there's new stuff here for the Swiss and the Ethiopians as well. But the expansion also includes all new mechanics for every nation around the world, meaning this might be one of the most interesting expansions for HOI4 in a while. Let's get right into the meat of things, shall we? Italy is the main event in this expansion, and for good reason. It's one of the main actors of World War II, and its lands, whether later on in the war in Italy, or the decisive African campaign in Italian colonies, were major theaters of the war. And yet, up until now, this country, situated smack down in the middle of the Mediterranean, has remained in the Stone Age of 2016, having its focus tree looking unbelievably tiny and unfinished. It shows us how far this game has come, I think, when this new focus tree is absolutely bonkers. Italy is of course the junior partner in the Axis family, and in 1936 struggles not only with several intra-war modifiers that severely cramps your fascist style, but these can of course be improved and removed with time, and the first obstacle to Italy's greatness is none other than Ethiopia, the last stronghold of independent African nationhood. In my experience, it's much harder to take Ethiopia than it was, at least it's much more important now. You see, the Ethiopian campaign decides much of Italy's early and middle game, especially because, number 1, it determines a large part of Italy's new focus tree, which focuses on development in the African provinces, and 2, depending on how the war goes, and how fast you conquer Ethiopia, you'll have to deal with an entire resistance versus compliance minigame, where Ethiopia is pacified. You might even risk the Ethiopian government leaving for the UK as a government in exile, and if that happens, well, then your war will continue until Ethiopia no longer owns the cores, which is going to take a long time. Of course, Ethiopia is just the beginning, and even Italy's path on the focus tree is determined by it. Depending on how you're doing, you may even lock yourself out of certain paths, like the monarchy path for example. And speaking of paths, there is so much fun here for Italy now. You can of course remain Italy, but you can also create the Greater Italy, the kingdom itself, or the Roman Empire. So there's a whole lot of ways of wresting control of the Mediterranean once more. Looking at Ethiopia again, I do like that a big part of the tree focuses on Italy's development and control of the region, as you'll have to deal with the compliance game either way. Italy gets an entirely new police force called Colonial Police, which is extremely effective at lowering resistance without removing too much compliance, especially because many focuses improve the police force here. This of course ties into the entirely new missions and event system for Italy, which the war in Ethiopia is a big part of. But Mussolini himself has missions for you, and they vary from being about improving the industry, to the army, and much more. As long as Mussolini is in power, he will give you the same missions every game, and even though it can become predictable if you play Fascist Italy a lot, it does give it some nice flavor. And speaking of flavor, both Italy, Ethiopia, and Switzerland has a new government mechanic which essentially see you balance the power of two government factions. In Italy, this battle stands between Mussolini himself and the Grand Council of Fascism, and depending on how much influence either one of them has, you gain bonuses to a certain extent until you begin accumulating debuffs. So the balance of power is quite a balancing act in itself. It's influenced by various actions, such as winning certain wars or completing certain focuses for example, but can be very directly affected by spending political power to either support or sabotage Mussolini. All in all then, I really enjoy the factional change of Italy itself, and it's been the faction I focused the most on for this video, as it also is the main faction in this expansion. But I will say that it's really cool that Ethiopia has gotten as much love as it has, especially in terms of its branching paths, where there are several ways to survive now. Among them is keeping on fighting the Italians and hoping for the best, allying the Italians as a lesser power, or going full communist. I love that if you go democratic, it's possible to unify the continent of Africa through the African Union faction, or as communist, conquer the continent and become the African Union itself. Ethiopia offers a challenging campaign to say the least, so make sure you brace yourself for that one. In the same vein, Switzerland has an entirely new focus tree as well. Unlike Ethiopia, it's all about choosing paths. Now you can much more than before declare for the Allies, the Fascists, the Communists, or tread your own path entirely. And as always, I love these choices and the fleshing out of factions a whole lot. Now if only we could get unique focus trees for Norway and the Scandinavian factions, that would be much appreciated, Paradox. Of course, there is much more to By Blood alone than unique faction mechanics and new focus trees. Many aspects of the game have received large overhauls. One of these is the new peace conference mechanic, which is now much more fleshed out than before. Now you can not only puppet your enemies, but you can demand resources in the process, including oil, factories, demanding their navies, or even have their countries declare demilitarized zones. In addition, we can now design our very own aircraft, just like we do tanks. And speaking of tanks, the production of aircraft and tanks now follow a completely different formula. Instead of making fighters or light tanks, we make the parts for said models, and then build them ourselves. It's definitely a more complex system, and adds to an already extremely complex game where so much is possible already. It might take some time to learn and get the hang of, but if you love Hearts of Iron and all you want is more stuff to do, well, I say dig in. What I think is particularly fun is how the game now tracks essentially every unit in the game, and their experiences and history. Every division officer is now neatly tracked in this menu, and depending on their actions, you'll see their accomplishments here. If they've done particularly well, it's even possible to award them medals for honorable service, giving them quite the large boost to whatever you choose to focus on. This kind of reminds me of the legionary system in Imperator Rome actually, and I have to say I'm a massive fan of micromanaging division history and accomplishments like this, as it makes each division feel that much more unique. It's also an interesting choice to include the option to embargo a nation if they have created enough world tension. I imagine this can be a really fun mechanic for multiplayer games, as this makes embargo alliances and cooperation that much more important. By Blood alone is in the end an expansion that focuses on arguably one of the most fun factions in the game, namely Italy, and branches out two minor ones as well, Switzerland and Ethiopia. It does a great job of bringing more flavor and possibilities to these nations, and I for one love playing Italy now, as the race for Ethiopia, and possibly conquest in the Baltic region, which surely sets you on the path to greatness, is a lot of fun to achieve. I definitely have to get better at my compliance game though, but apart from that, I'm really happy to be back with Hearts of Iron 4, and a new expansion like this is the perfect way to hone my skills. Apart from the faction-specific improvements, I love the overall improvements that impact the game no matter who you're playing as, like the new peace conference mechanic, or the upgradable division officers, who will surely make every campaign, war, and battle that much more memorable. If you've been looking to have a lot more fun in the Mediterranean or Africa, either as colonizer or freedom fighter, then I highly recommend By Blood alone, as I find that it really changes up the game for the better. Thank you so much for watching. Hearts of Iron 4 is a great game that keeps improving every year, and I really wonder where and when it'll all end. But that day is not this day. And if you enjoyed this video, I really hope you leave a like, a comment, and sub to the channel, and consider supporting me as a YouTube member or a patron. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.